Lorena was finally returning home after spending the last few years in an exchange program in Japan. This trip had been one of the biggest dreams of her life, but she had to give up her great love, Daniel, to embark on this adventure. Daniel said he would wait for Lorena until she returned, but Mrs. Esther, Lorena's mother, convinced her to end the relationship because it was hindering her future. 2 years later, when Lorena returned to the country and finally landed at the airport, she did not expect to find Daniel begging. Lorena felt her heart race as the plane landed at Curitiba Airport. She had been waiting for this moment for months, longing to return to her mother's welcoming arms and relive the memories of a life that seemed to have been left behind. However, as soon as she got off the plane and looked around, a wave of nostalgia and uncertainty enveloped her. The familiar air of the city brought back memories of a past she had left behind. There were smiles and tears, promises and goodbyes, all mixed in a whirlwind of emotions that she had not yet fully understood. After 2 years, Lorena was finally returning home after completing her exchange program in Japan. This decision was not easy, as to fulfill this dream, Lorena had to leave the great love of her life behind. Her mother's support was extremely important in helping her overcome these barriers. As Lorena mingled with the crowd at the airport exit, her eyes roamed the surroundings, capturing every face and every movement of the passers-by. Lorena was standing on the sidewalk, unsuccessfully trying to hail a taxi. It was then that she saw, in the distance, among the crowd, a young man begging with a child in his arms. Both seemed displaced and vulnerable. A chill ran down Lorena's spine as she noticed something familiar in the man's posture. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached with uncertain steps and confused thoughts. As she got closer, their eyes met, and she saw the confirmation of her suspicions reflected in his eyes. It was Daniel, the great love of her life, standing there before her. Time seemed to freeze as Lorena observed him, taking in every detail of his face. He looked older now, more tired, but there was still a spark of familiarity in his eyes that made Lorena's heart ache. Daniel was standing in front of her, yet at the same time so distant. The reality of the situation hit Lorena like a punch to the stomach. She had made a difficult decision to leave Daniel behind when she left for Japan, following her mother's advice and seeking new opportunities beyond the borders of her hometown. But now, all the memories of the happy days they spent together flooded her mind, bringing with them a deep and overwhelming pain. The silence between them was deafening, laden with the weight of all the unspoken words and unanswered questions. Lorena wanted to run into Daniel's arms, to scream his name and pour out all the anguish she had carried since she left, but something held her back, keeping her still and silent, trapped in a limbo between the past and the present. While Lorena struggled to find the right words, Daniel looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resignation in his eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to ask, but the words seemed to escape him like sand slipping through his fingers. Lorena felt her heart race as Daniel, gripped by panic, held the child tightly and began to run. A whirlwind of emotions enveloped her as she instinctively followed him, her legs moving almost on their own in a desperate attempt to catch up with him. The city's streets seemed to blur before her eyes, and the faces of the pedestrians became indistinct blurs as Lorena chased after Daniel and the child. Her thoughts were a chaos, a mix of absurd anger, sadness, and concern, all swirling in her mind like a furious storm. As she ran, Lorena tried desperately to understand what was happening. Why was Daniel there, begging on the street, while she was thousands of miles away? Where were the dreams they shared and the promises they made to each other when they were young and full of hope? Lorena's breath was labored as she continued to chase Daniel, her footsteps echoing through the now empty streets of the city. As they approached the climax of that desperate chase, Lorena knew she could not let him escape without first getting answers and understanding what had happened to the man she once loved more than anything. Finally, after a chase that seemed to last an eternity, Daniel stopped abruptly in front of a square. With irregular breathing, he looked back with eyes full of fear and anguish. Lorena approached slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest, and stopped in front of him, unable to say a word. Lorena then held Daniel by the shoulders, preventing him from running again, while time seemed to stop around them. The air was charged with palpable tension, as if the weight of all the years of separation was compressing them, making it difficult even to breathe. She looked into Daniel's eyes, seeing the pain and despair reflected there, while tears streamed freely down her face. The child in Daniel's arms began to cry, sensing the tension in the air, and Lorena felt a lump form in her throat. She knew this was the moment to resolve all the loose ends, the time to face the past and finally find a way to move forward. Panting, still trying to catch her breath after the frantic chase through the city's streets, Lorena didn't know where to start. The words seemed to escape her, evading her mind as she struggled to express all the emotions consuming her at that moment. Finally, after a long moment of tense silence, Lorena found the courage to speak, her voice sounding weak and trembling. "Daniel, it's been so long. Why did you run? Who is this child? What is happening?" Lorena looked at Daniel, desperately waiting for an answer that did not come. He remained silent, and the tears continued to stream down his face like a river of repressed emotions. She could feel the pain he carried but needed to understand what had brought him to this state. "Daniel, please," she implored, her voice trembling with the intensity of her emotions. "You need to tell me what happened. I can't leave until you tell me the truth." At that moment, a police car pulled up next to them. The officer looked suspiciously at the situation and asked Lorena, "Ma'am, is this man bothering you? The city is full of people begging, and crime is on the rise. If you need help, let us know now. It's time for this beggar to be sent to a shelter, and this child to be referred to Child Protective Services." Hearing that, Lorena was frightened. She knew she couldn't say goodbye to Daniel without resolving this. She looked at the man before her, the man who was once the love of her life, and knew she couldn't abandon him now, not when he needed her most. Indignant with the police's attitude and determined to understand the situation, Lorena finally replied, "It's okay. This is an old friend of mine, and we're just talking. Please, don't worry about us." The officer continued to eye the situation with suspicion, but after Lorena's response, the police car finally drove away. At that moment, relief washed over Lorena for a few seconds. The fear of Daniel being taken away and losing the opportunity to clarify what was happening gripped her body. She knew that conversation was essential and that she needed to understand what had happened between them to finally move on with her life. Lorena, Daniel, and the child remained motionless in front of the square, while the silence hung between them like a dense fog. The tension in the air was palpable, and each moment seemed charged with the promise of painful revelations and difficult truths to face. The police intervention only served to increase the tension even more. "Daniel, please, tell me what happened," Lorena asked again, her voice gentle but firm. "I need to understand. I need to know why you're here, begging on the street, with a child in your arms. What happened in these 2 years?" Daniel sighed, running his hand through his disheveled hair before finally finding the courage to speak. He invited Lorena to sit on a nearby bench. "I need to sit and calm down a bit before I can say everything. Things have been difficult, Lorena." His words came out in a hoarse whisper, each one laden with the pain of the fate that had befallen him over the years. As they settled on the bench, Lorena felt the urgency to address the issue that had been bothering her so much. "My mother told me about your ex-wife's pregnancy," she began, looking for any reaction in Daniel. She hoped for an explanation that would make sense and justify what had happened during her absence. Each word seemed heavy and laden with years of accumulated doubts and hurts. She watched Daniel intently, looking for any sign that would help her understand the situation. Daniel let out a bitter sigh before responding. "Your mother told you everything, didn't she?" he said, evident bitterness in his voice. "You stopped communicating with me, Lorena. You didn't care to call and ask what was happening. You just believed everything your mother said, didn't you?" His words carried deep pain and an accusation that Lorena couldn't ignore. She found herself confronted with the possibility of having misjudged the situation, influenced by incomplete and biased information from her mother, who had always been against her relationship with Daniel. Each word from him seemed to pierce her heart, making her question all the choices she had made since leaving for Japan. Daniel then continued to speak. "If you only knew what happened. I don't know if I have the strength to continue. It's hard to see you doing so well when my life fell apart. I asked your mother to give me your new contact in Japan, but she said you had nothing to say to me." A wave of regret, mixed with a sense of injustice, flooded Lorena. She realized that not only had she allowed her mother's words to drive her away from Daniel, but she had also allowed fear and uncertainty to cloud her judgment. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she murmured, her voice choked by the tears threatening to overflow. "I shouldn't have believed everything she said. I should have given you a chance to tell your side of the story." Daniel looked at her with eyes full of sadness and pain. "I understand, Lorena," he said softly, "but now we can't change the past. We can only try to understand what happened and move forward the best way we can." Lorena nodded, knowing Daniel was right. She couldn't turn back time and change the choices she had made, but she could learn from her mistakes and try to fix what was within her reach. As they still sat on the bench, the sun began to set on the horizon, and Lorena felt a glimmer of hope rise in her heart. She knew that conversation would be difficult, but she was also relieved to finally discover what had happened during the years she had been out of the country. However, thinking that Daniel had gotten involved with another woman, a sudden anger filled her chest. Despite her mother's encouragement to leave the relationship behind and prioritize the exchange program to boost her professional future, Lorena never stopped loving Daniel and considering him the great love of her life. Even trying to remain calm, Lorena let her anger slip and said, "You got another woman pregnant, Daniel. What wouldn't I understand about this story? You simply replaced me while I was thinking about you on the other side of the world?" She spoke with words laden with pain she never imagined facing. The confusion and desire to understand the truth were evident in her voice. Daniel saw the sincerity in Lorena's eyes, and the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He knew he couldn't delay the truth any longer and that he needed to explain everything from the beginning, even if it meant reliving the most painful moments of his life. He took a deep breath, seeking the courage to face what was coming. "Lorena, I never wanted to hurt you," he began, his voice trembling with the intensity of his emotions. "When you left for Japan, I was lost. I missed you every day, and the loneliness was overwhelming. I never replaced you, you need to understand that." Lorena listened intently, her hands trembling as she struggled to hold back the tears threatening to overflow. She wanted to believe Daniel's words and find a way to forgive him, but the pain of that moment was still fresh in her mind, like a blade making a deep cut in her heart. "I was still recovering from the end of our relationship and your trip to Japan. Then she appeared," Daniel continued, his voice breaking for a moment before continuing. I was weak, Lorena. I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it every day since then. Lorena felt a knot form in her throat as she listened to Daniel's words, and the weight of imagining him with another woman bore down on her like an anchor. She wanted to scream, cry, and run away, never to look back again. At the same time, she knew she needed to face the truth and find a way to forgive him and move forward with her life. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice choked by the tears she could no longer contain, "I know I have to forgive you, but it's all so difficult for me. I need time to process all this. I just hope that one day we can find a way to overcome all this together." At that moment, Daniel felt unjustly treated because of everything he had been through in the last few years. Determined to clarify the facts, he began to tell his side of the story. Daniel described how, after Lorena left for her exchange program in Japan, he focused on his final exams at medical school. Every free moment was dedicated to books and preparing for the future. One day, after leaving university exhausted, he met Estella, an old childhood friend who had also become a college mate. It had been only a few weeks since Lorena had started her exchange program on the other side of the world. Estella was one of the most popular girls on campus, as she was the heiress of the richest family in town. When she saw him, Estella offered him a ride home, which he accepted without suspicion. After all, Estella had been a friend, and he would never have imagined that her kindness had a sinister purpose. On the way, Estella stopped at a gas station to fill up. She went to the convenience store to make the payment and, returning, offered Daniel a bottle of beer. He, tired from a day full of studies and wanting to relax, accepted the gesture without thinking about the possible consequences. What happened next would be a tragic turning point in his life. Daniel paused before continuing. As tears streamed down his face, sometimes Lorena had difficulty understanding his words due to the sobs that interrupted his voice. Daniel finally continued, explaining how, after taking a few sips of the beer, he started to feel strange. His legs felt heavy, and his vision began to blur. Daniel began to suspect he had been drugged, but it was too late. Estella took advantage of his vulnerability and took him to a motel, where she drugged him again and left him unconscious. Daniel continued his narrative with a trembling voice, recalling the events that changed his life forever. "If I could turn back time, Lorena, I would have done everything differently and would have gone after you in Japan. I accepted that beer without imagining the consequences it would have on my life. After that, everything became a blur in my memory, and I could barely remember what happened. In my mind, only a series of confused and fragmented flashes passed, making no sense at all." Daniel then described how he woke up the next morning in a strange room, with intense pain and overwhelming shame. Beside him, Estella lay on the bed with a satisfied smile on her lips. Daniel felt his stomach churn when she began to speak. Estella's words were laden with malice and cruelty. "I really enjoyed the night we had, Daniel," she said in a casual tone that made the words even more disturbing. "I think Lorena will also like it when she sees our video." Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet when Estella mentioned the video. Horrified, he saw the images she had recorded, showing him altered and vulnerable, unable to defend himself from the cruel manipulations of that woman. Daniel finally understood what was happening and that he had been used by Estella. Lorena listened in silence, horror spreading across her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what Daniel was sharing. She never imagined something so terrible could happen or that someone could be so cruel and inhuman to him. "Daniel, I am so sorry," she murmured, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him with compassion. Daniel then continued, saying that he was terrified and tried to understand the motive behind that monstrosity. Estella revealed that she had put something in his beer and filmed the night they spent together, ensuring that no one would believe him if he tried to report her. She said the video would be proof that he was enjoying it, in a cruel manipulation that left him with no way out. Daniel felt a crushing despair. Fleeing the motel where Estella had taken him, he cried all night, not knowing how to deal with the situation. The cruelty of the betrayal by someone he trusted left him deeply scarred. Reliving the story to clarify the past with Lorena, Daniel also fought against the tears as he remembered the terrible night he had spent because of Estella's trap. He felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake up, and his mind spun with the return to the horror of what had happened at that moment. Daniel found himself reliving those moments of humiliation and despair. He felt powerless in the face of Estella's cruelty. Daniel thought about how she had manipulated and destroyed everything he loved and believed in within minutes. Lorena listened in silence, with a mixture of anger and compassion burning inside her as she thought about what Daniel had been through. She had never felt so much hatred for anyone as she did for Estella at that moment. The idea that someone could cause so much suffering to another human being made her sick to her core. Daniel then said he decided not to go to the police, fearing the power and influence of Estella's family in the city. He wanted to forget the incident and focus on his studies, but shortly afterward, he received a call from Estella saying she was pregnant. The news came as a devastating blow. In the same week, Daniel learned that his father's health, the only family member he had, was deteriorating rapidly. For this reason, Daniel was forced to give up graduating from medical school, even though he was close to finishing. His father's illness was a cruel battle against an relentless ailment and became a shadow that hung over Daniel, obscuring any hope of light. Daniel found himself submerged in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, struggling to cope with the pain of the past while facing his father's inevitable fate. In the following months, his father's health deteriorated more and more rapidly. Each day was a battle against the inevitability of death approaching. Daniel found himself running between the hospital and his home, desperate to spend every precious moment by his father's side before it was too late. And then, one day, his father was gone, leaving Daniel completely desolate and alone to face his new reality. The loss of his father was a deep blow, leaving him adrift in a sea of sorrow and despair, like a wound that seemed never to heal. Lorena listened in silence as Daniel's pain echoed in her own soul. She tried to imagine the agony he had faced over the past few years. Lorena wanted to comfort him and ease his pain, but she knew there were no words that could console a broken heart dealing with the loss of his father. Daniel suffered another hard blow during the funeral. Estella appeared, casting an even darker shadow over an already sorrowful moment. She called him to talk, and her presence felt like a stab to his still aching heart. Estella wasted no time and began to threaten him with her voice whispering venom, as she spoke about the consequences he would face if he didn't assume their relationship. She said the pregnancy would soon be the talk of the town, and if he didn't want to face problems, he should accept her proposal. "You know what's best for you, Daniel," she continued with cold eyes. "You have a simple choice: assume the child and live a happy life by my side, or face the consequences of your choices." Daniel felt cornered, with no way out in the face of Estella's cruel words. He knew her family had money, and that Estella wouldn't hesitate to use it against him if he didn't meet her demands. And so he gave in, accepting to live a life of lies and deceit to protect his future. Months passed, and Estella gave birth, bringing an innocent child into the world under the weight of a lie. It was then that Daniel became the father of a beautiful boy named Kaio. They lived together in a luxurious apartment in the city center, which belonged to Estella's father. But behind the facade of happiness, there was a growing darkness threatening to engulf them. A year after Kaio's birth, Estella ran away from home, leaving behind only a note saying she could no longer stand living with Daniel and that she deserved to be happy. Daniel was devastated, seeing his life crumble around him as he struggled to understand what had happened. When he sought support from Estella's parents, Daniel was met with coldness and indifference. They said Caio, their grandson, was a bastard child of a wayward daughter who had disappeared without a trace. Furthermore, Estella's father said their relationship was a disgrace to the family and that Daniel should no longer contact them. Daniel felt alone and helpless. His life had become a ruin of broken promises and shattered dreams. Even so, he knew he needed to continue and find a way to move forward, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. With this determination burning within his chest, he began to chart a new path of redemption and hope, where he could finally find the peace he so desperately sought. However, nothing went as planned. Without a family after his father's death and evicted from Estella's parents' luxurious apartment, Daniel found himself on the streets with a baby in his arms and nowhere to go. Since then, he had been getting by between the sidewalks and shelters of the city, struggling to feed his ever-growing child. Daniel's story left Lorena deeply shaken. She realized how much she had been deceived by her mother's opinions, who had never supported her relationship with Daniel. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, revealing the terrible consequences of her influence over her past choices. "I'm sorry you went through all this. I wish I had been here to support you. I won't leave you now," said Lorena with a trembling voice and eyes overflowing with regret. She approached Daniel, wrapping him in a comforting hug in an attempt to offer the solace he so desperately needed. The realization that she had been manipulated by her mother brought a new perspective to the situation. Lorena realized she had allowed others' opinions to influence her decisions, ignoring her own feelings and intuitions. For this reason, she felt determined to make amends, to correct past mistakes, and to build a future with Daniel. Daniel looked at Lorena with gratitude and love shining in his eyes. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was grateful to have Lorena by his side as he faced an uncertain future. "Thank you so much, Lorena. This means a lot to me." And so, sitting on that park bench, they began to rebuild what had been broken, united by love and the determination not to let anything separate them again. Lorena then decided to follow her heart and spend the first days of her vacation in Brazil with Daniel, renting a house in the countryside so they could stay together for a few days. During this period, she strove to regain his trust and provide a safe environment for Daniel and his son Caio. Every moment they spent together was an opportunity to strengthen their bond and heal the wounds of the past with the goal of building a future together. Lorena was determined to prove to Daniel and to herself that they deserved a second chance, away from the toxic influences that had previously separated them. A week before returning to Curitiba, they made an important decision: to make their relationship official. Despite the short time since their reunion, they recognized the depth of their feelings and the importance of being together. Lorena promised that when they got married, there would be a celebration worthy of the occasion, a beautiful party, even if simple, to mark the beginning of a new life together. Additionally, Lorena decided to adopt Caio, formalizing the bond she had developed with the child. She knew this was an important step to consolidate the new family they were building together, being a gesture of love and commitment that she was more than willing to make. When they returned from the trip, Lorena and Daniel soon rented a small house in the city. After sorting this out, she decided to finally visit her mother. Mrs. Esther had spent the last few weeks incessantly trying to contact Lorena, knowing that Lorena's flight had arrived from Japan, but Lorena had not given any news or gone to the family home. Lorena knew she needed to confront her and reveal everything she had discovered, as well as communicate her decision to marry Daniel. Even though it was going to be a difficult conversation, Lorena was determined to face the truth and move on with her life. When she arrived, she found Mrs. Esther visibly upset. She was sobbing and yelling, trying to justify her actions with empty words of remorse. "Everything I did was out of love for you, Lorena, and you have the nerve to come back from Japan and not return home," she repeated in a desperate tone. Lorena faced her mother firmly, and her own words echoed with determination. "Mom, you had no right to influence me this way. You convinced me to trade Daniel for the exchange program, and it almost ruined his life," said Lorena, firm and unwavering. "He and I are a family now, and always will be. I can no longer allow your manipulations and lies to control my future." For Mrs. Esther, this was a painful moment, full of raw emotions and hard truths to face. For her part, Lorena knew it was time to cut ties with the toxic past her mother represented, to move on and build a life based on love and honesty. The visit to her mother's house was tense, but she remained steadfast. Mrs. Esther did not accept her daughter's decision, insisting she was making a mistake by taking on the responsibility of someone else's child. Her arguments echoed in the small living room, laden with disapproval and concern. "You will regret this, girl. Change your mind and save your life before it's too late." However, Lorena was determined to move forward with her new family. She looked into her mother's eyes with a determined expression, reflecting her inner conviction. "I will not abandon Daniel and my son," she said firmly, her voice full of determination. "They are not to blame for the circumstances and deserve a chance at happiness." And so, while the argument continued in the living room, Lorena did not back down. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that she would face criticism and judgment, but she was willing to endure it all for the sake of her new family. At the end of the conversation, as she said goodbye to Mrs. Esther, Lorena felt a mix of sadness and relief. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew she was doing the right thing by protecting Daniel and Kaio. With this certainty warming her heart, she returned to the rented house with Daniel, ready to face the future with courage and determination. Days later, Lorena was shopping in the city to furnish the new house when she suddenly encountered Estella in a department store. Estella, noticing her presence, quickly commented provocatively, "You came back to the city after losing your boyfriend? I bet he's a wreck." Despite the anger boiling inside her, Lorena controlled herself and maintained her composure. She looked directly into Estella's eyes and replied firmly, "I would love to see you pay for everything you've done, but I won't dirty my hands. One day you will pay for everything. Daniel and his son are my family now." Estella tried to laugh off the threat, but something in Lorena's gaze indicated she was serious. Lorena's firm and determined posture deeply scared Estella, as she never imagined that the past would come back to haunt her. Without saying another word, Lorena turned her back and walked away, leaving Estella stunned and disconcerted by the strength of those words. For a brief moment, Estella felt the weight of her past actions like a dark shadow of guilt and fear that would soon exact its price. Lorena, on the other hand, moved forward with her head held high, knowing she had done the right thing by not stooping to Estella's level. She promised herself that justice would be served, even if it took time, and that one day Estella would face the consequences of her crimes. A month later, Lorena and Daniel were stabilizing their life in the new house when they received the news that Estella had been arrested. She was accused of trafficking illicit substances, in addition to drugging her victims and blackmailing them with intimate footage. The news brought a mix of relief and happiness, as well as a sense of justice for the couple who still bore emotional scars from Estella's actions. Determined to restart their lives once and for all, Lorena and Daniel made a radical decision: they would move to another country with their son. They chose to live in Japan, as Lorena had lived there for 2 years and was accustomed to Japanese culture. It would be an opportunity to leave behind all the painful memories of the past and live the future in a completely new environment. The months of adapting to the new country were not easy. They faced challenges and obstacles along the way, but their determination to rebuild their lives kept them united and resilient. Together, they faced each challenge with courage and determination, knowing that better days were ahead. Far from the painful memories of the past and the people who tried to harm them, Lorena and Daniel found a more welcoming and safe environment to raise Kaio and build a new story together. They discovered new opportunities and horizons, embracing each moment as a chance for growth and renewal. After getting used to their new home, Lorena and Daniel felt a sense of peace and hope in their hearts. They looked to the future with hope and optimism, knowing they were ready to face anything life might throw at them. Together, they were ready to write a new chapter in their lives, a chapter of love, courage, and an unwavering determination to find the happiness they so deserved. A year after moving to Japan, Lorena and Daniel decided to celebrate their union in a small chapel in Osaka, the city where they lived. The ceremony was simple but full of meaning, with the presence of the new friends they had made over time, as well as Lorena's old exchange student colleagues. The decoration of the party was modest but charming, reflecting the simplicity and true love they shared. The most emotional moment of the ceremony was when Kaio brought the rings, walking with a shy but proud smile. It was as if that simple gesture represented not only the union of Lorena and Daniel but also the formation of a new family built on the foundations of love, trust, and mutual commitment. Lorena was radiant in her wedding dress, with happiness written all over her face. She looked at Daniel with tenderness, knowing they were about to embark on an exciting journey together, celebrating life's joys side by side. When Daniel saw her, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and love. He knew he had found his soulmate in Lorena, someone who loved him unconditionally and was willing to share all the joys and sorrows of life with him. Even though fate had tried to separate them, Daniel understood at that moment that all his suffering had been worth it. As Lorena and Daniel exchanged vows of eternal love, the small chapel filled with joy and hope. It was a moment of deep connection, marking the beginning of a new chapter in that family's life. As they left the chapel as husband and wife, Lorena and Daniel felt blessed to have found each other. After the ceremony, Lorena and Daniel continued to build their lives together in Japan, far from the people who once tried to harm them. They dedicated themselves to creating a safe and loving environment for their son, far from the shadows of the past. Protected by distance and time, the two found the peace they had been seeking. Lorena often reflected on the path that had led them there. In one of those reflections, she commented to Daniel, "Do you believe that when we're destined to be with someone, nothing can separate us from them?" The question resonated with the journey they had faced to find each other again, reinforcing the belief that true love overcomes any obstacle. Together, Lorena and Daniel discovered that happiness lay in the simplicity of shared moments and the strength of the love that united them. Walking hand in hand towards the future, Lorena and Daniel felt grateful for having discovered the true meaning of love, a love that strengthened and inspired them to live each day with passion and purpose. And with that love as their compass, they were ready to face any challenge the future held, knowing that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. And there you have it. Did you enjoy the story? The Story Life channel appreciates your company. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below on what you thought of the story. Until next time,